This is All India Radio Mangaluru. Dear listeners, in today's Talk in English program now, Dr. Praveen Shetty, Assistant Professor, Department of Humanities and Management, Manipal Institute of Technology, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Manipal, will speak on the topic Intercultural Communication.
Imagine that you made a presentation on a topic of your choice and your supervisor just pointed out the mistakes. No words of praise, just criticism. How would you feel? Is your boss harsh? Is this too rude? Yes, it is true if you are an Indian or operating in a context of Asia or Latin America. Maybe it is not harsh, maybe it is not rude if you are in France or let's say Spain. Yes, our notions of right and wrong may vary based on the cultures that we belong to. As we live in an increasingly multicultural world, communication is no more limited to the use of language. We all may speak the same language, let's say English, but we may mean different things using the same sentence. Let me give an example for this. Imagine you happen to meet an Indian friend in a party and the friend says, "Nice to see you after a long time and we should meet at some time for coffee." More often than not, you realize that this is just a polite talk and she does not mean to meet you for a coffee, and you reciprocate the polite talk with a smile or with the appropriate words. Now imagine you have met a German friend in a party and the friend says, "Nice to see you after a long time. We should meet sometime for coffee." Now, the German lady truly means that you should meet for a coffee and she means to have a scheduled meeting. As an insider to the Indian context, you may understand the cues hidden in the message of your Indian friend and you may pass it off. But if you apply the same cues to the words of your German friend, then you are making a mistake. The values and norms practiced in a society that we are dealing with vary in many respects from those from our own culture and the people from other cultures. For instance, in the example you heard, the ideas of direct communication and indirect communication are predominantly operated. This is what we precisely call intercultural communication. Intercultural communication is the individual's ability to communicate between people belonging to different cultures and understand the variation in the value systems, norms, and assumptions. That brings us to the question, what is culture? Now, an easy definition of culture is a set of shared beliefs, values, and practices. However, an established definition of culture from the field of intercultural communication is given by a Dutch anthropologist, Geert Hofstede, who says culture is the collective programming of the human mind that distinguishes the members of one community from those of another. In this sense, culture is a system of collectively held values, and individuals within the culture share certain accepted values and norms, and this may differ from the values and norms of the people from a different culture. And this is exactly where we have differences in terms of our orientation to time, our orientation to values, our orientation to the ideas of what is right and what is wrong. So that brings us to the second part of our talk. Are there certain frameworks across cultures which helps us to understand how to make sense of the communication of the people belonging to different cultures? And that brings us to the beginning of intercultural communication, a term coined by an American anthropologist, Edward T. Hall. Edward T. Hall, in 1959, in his book, The Silent Language, brings two important concepts. One, orientation to time, and the second, communication style. Now let's deal with the first one. According to Edward T. Hall, communities across the world have two different orientation to time. Certain cultures believe in monochronic approach and certain cultures believe in polychronic approach. For example, some communities in North Europe or in American cultures view time in a linear fashion, where one thing happens at a time. Whereas cultures like India and other communities in Asia, Latin American countries, and also in the southern European countries like Spain or Italy, the cultures believe in polychronic approach. Now, the polychronic approach refers to involving multiple tasks at a given point of time. This might seem simpler, but in practice, it actually influences our ways in a number of ways. Now, imagine you are working in a polychronic society like India, where the time is circular. You have made an appointment with your supervisor, let's say for 3 p.m. And you go to the office, you meet your supervisor at 11 a.m. and your supervisor is free and you have a minor point to discuss in the meeting. How would you approach it? Is it okay to go to the supervisor and discuss the point and complete the task? Both are free after the talk? Would it be fine? More often than not, this would be fine in the Indian context. But imagine the same thing being operated in the German context, or let's say in the Dutch context. You have a meeting at 3 p.m., you have a minor point to complete, and you meet your boss at 11 a.m., you go to the supervisor, talk to him, wish him, greet him, but you do not discuss the points that you have reserved for 3 p.m. meeting, because it is a scheduled meeting, an assignated task, you cannot change it. And that is how cultures with linear approach to time work. You have an appointment at 3 p.m., you complete the appointment at 3 p.m. No matter who is free, or if your boss is free, you are free, the actions take place at the same time, at the designated time. And that is what we mean by monochronic approach. Polychronic cultures accept interruptions, variations, and doing multiple things as normal. Monochronic cultures believe that action should be done in a structured approach and every action should happen as per the schedule. So this is one way of approaching how people look at time differently. Now let's move on to the second concept or the second framework mentioned by Edward T. Hall. This is called high context culture and low context cultures. Now this is something very interesting because Edward T. Hall says that certain cultures in the world believe in expressing or conveying information only through the words, whereas certain cultures in the world believe in conveying information not just by the words, but by the context associated with that. Whom are you speaking to? How are you speaking to that person? Matters a lot than what are you speaking to the person. This operates primarily with us, the Indians, when we move to a low context culture. We are typically high context culture where our words do not mean exactly what we say, but it is our gestures, our tone, and the context determines. Let me give an example for this. Most of the time, people from high context cultures find it difficult to say no. And instead of that, we express our refusal to do something in polite words. Maybe. I think I will try. Now, this happens often in our conversation. Let me give a personal example. What happened in my interaction with the German professor? I was a novice just first week into my profession and I was sharing the cabin with this German professor. I entered the cabin. This professor, 11 a.m., was eating a lushy green apple from his orchard and I was super hungry. And the professor offers me the apple and asks me, Praveen, would you like to have the apple? And my instant reaction, which I was tuned to from the Indian context, no sir, thank you. And the professor goes on eating the apple without offering it to me the next time. And I was there sitting in front of him thinking he would offer it to me once again. Now this made me think, what is happening in this cultural communication context? I, from a high context culture, carried my baggage of the idea of modesty and thought in the first instance when somebody offers something, you should say no. And when the second instance, when they offer, you should accept it. Now, this is my context, my idea. Whereas the context for the German professor was entirely different. For the German professor, if I did not like the apple, I would say no. If I want the apple, I would say yes. There is no ambiguity there. So the words convey what you mean. And there is no way he could understand I said yes when I said no. This is exactly the difference between high context and low context. Because for a German, it is indecent or impolite to insist another person to do something when that person already said no. It is a matter of respecting that person's view. Now, this is what we mean by difference in communication style. There is a direct communication style where the words mean exactly what they mean, and there is an indirect communication style where words do not mean exactly what they mean. It is the context and the person and the gesture and the tone that defines the meaning of the communication. So if you were to align the cultures on a scale, now the Scandinavian countries and Netherlands and North European countries like Germany would come to the top of low context communication style or direct communication style. Americans, British, France would fall somewhere in the middle. And then comes the cultures like Spain, Italy, who are slightly on the indirect communication style or the high context communication style. And finally comes countries like Arab countries, Asian countries like Japan and India, and also the Latin American countries where the communication is always in the context. Now, what happens if you are from a high context or indirect communication style, and if you are operating with a person who is from a low context or a direct communication style, our cultural messages or hidden cues are never translated to the understanding of that person. So, it becomes necessary for us to communicate directly using words which actually mean what they mean. Geert Hofstede in 1981, in his book called Culture's Consequences, brings out 4 major cultural dimensions. And he calls them the frameworks with which you can understand how certain communication takes place within communities. For instance, 1, power distance. Now, the idea of power distance means to what extent hierarchy is accepted as a norm within a structure. For instance, in India, we have high power distance. That means the decision is finally made by the leader. They might listen to all others, take opinion from everyone, but the final decision lies with the leader. And once that decision is made, you cannot actually question it openly in a meeting because the hierarchy is respected. Similarly, there is a concept called uncertainty avoidance and individualism and collectivism. We as a collective society believe in doing work with the team, whereas in an individual society, the individual becomes responsible for the work. So all these parameters are actually the frameworks within which cultures vary in their style of communication. So what we do as someone who could work across cultures is understand that there are differences across cultures in terms of orientation to time, orientation to values, orientation to respect, and in terms of idea of modesty. Once we recognize these differences, we understand people are not actually rude, as I told in the first sentence. It is just a matter of cultural difference. And this feature of understanding intercultural competence and intercultural nuances becomes extremely crucial for a world which is increasingly becoming globalized.
Dear listeners, you have just heard Dr. Praveen Shetty speaking on the topic Intercultural Communication. This talk came to you from the studios of All India Radio Mangaluru.